The truth hurts. It had just been a normal day. We'd opened the church up for yet another coffee morning and seen a few of the regulars drift into the church for coffee and to review the last Sunday's service, which had been videoed and then rerun on the church television monitor. We chatted to one or two people, but nothing special had happened. I closed the doors of the church and then Maurice and I settled down to our usual practice of having a prayer for the people who'd come in. We opened Oswald J. Smith's book, Compassion for Lost Souls, which Maurice and I had been reading through each day in the hope that God would give us the compassion that we so badly needed for our district. Although it was a very good book, it rarely made any impression upon me, probably because I was so self-centered that I couldn't identify with or have compassion for other people in their situations. But this particular day, God spoke loud and clear. In the chapter we were reading, Smith was talking about a man who lived in Africa. The village witch doctor had just died, and his position was now vacant. And this particular man, he badly wanted to fulfill this role of being the witch doctor. So he went off into the heart of the jungle and fasted for 7 whole days, at the end of which he was totally possessed by evil spirits and could do all sorts of magic, which now qualified him for the position that he so longed for. Maurice and I had just undergone some very detailed teaching from the Sermon on the Mount, so I was fully aware that fasting was supposed to be part of the everyday life of a Christian. Knowing about it is one thing, putting it into practice, now that's quite another. But it was then that I felt the sword of the Spirit pierce my heart and it made me look at my life afresh. This African man had given 7 complete days of his life in total abstinence to be possessed of evil spirits. And yet I'd never, ever given God 1 day. Okay, I'd given up a meal here or there, but I'd never allowed myself to be put at God's disposal. I always did only what I could handle myself. But now God was challenging me to give him a whole week to fast on water and pray so that he could possess me and use me. And because I knew without a shadow of a doubt that God was telling me to do this, I got really frightened. Maurice and I weren't married at this point, so I didn't feel the need to tell him what I'd decided to do. But I began to put my plan of action into operation. I knew for a fact that it'd be useless for me to stay at home in my flat, where the biscuit barrel and the bread bin would be screaming out my name and I'd feel powerless to refuse. I had to get away to somewhere where I was completely alone, where I was deprived of all temptation, to enable me to fulfill the obligation which I now owed to God. Whilst reading through a Christian magazine, I came across an advertisement which offered holiday accommodation in a cottage in Matlock, that's in Derbyshire, for a whole week, for the week of the Assemblies of God conference. Obviously, the owners had wanted to go to the conference and yet didn't want their home to be left vacant, so they were offering it for rental. I made contact with the owners and found out that they were the wardens of an Eventide home for elderly Christians, which was on the same road as their cottage. It was just 5 doors away, and that their church was also just around the corner, and they assured me I'd be made very welcome if I wanted to go. So, on the day appointed, I arrived in Matlock armed with Bible, hymnal and prophecy book, which I'd kept ever since God started speaking to me personally, and I was shown around the cottage by the people who were standing in for the wardens of the Eventide home. Although I didn't have a television in my own flat, I felt very relieved to find that there was one here, because I knew that on the nights when I'd be feeling very lonely, I'd be able to turn it on and have some company. But just before my guides left, they informed me that I wouldn't be able to use the television as something had been removed from it due to the fact that the licence fee hadn't been paid. So as soon as I was on my own, I made a much more detailed inspection of the house to see what facilities there were for me, and found that there was no radio, no cassette player, and the telephone, which was one of those old-fashioned dial things, had a lock on which enabled calls to come in, but none to go out. And nobody knew I was there except Maurice, and he wouldn't be there again until next week when he'd be collecting me. I suddenly felt very frightened and vulnerable. I was totally alone. God had asked me to spend a week with him, but I realised I didn't even know him. I'd served God for years in the church and I'd met regularly with other Christians for spiritual activities, but this was different. I reckoned it would be best if I could work out a schedule for the week. So I decided to spend 2 hours in the morning, prayer and Bible reading, 2 hours in the afternoon, and 2 hours in the evening. My spirit was willing, but my flesh was incredibly weak. I hadn't taken into account the violent headaches that began to attack me immediately. Being a very healthy and strong-minded person normally, I was totally unprepared for the weakness that came over my body as soon as I stopped eating. And this weakness seemed to affect everything that I did. Well, as the week progressed, I found that reading the Bible became absolutely impossible. The words would all jumble together and become a blur. My vision couldn't take in and focus what I was looking at. My mind began to wander, and I just couldn't concentrate for long periods to pray. Funny thing was, on the Wednesday evening, the standing deputy at the Eventide home called round to ask if I'd like to give a word to the old ladies the following morning. She knew that I'd come away for this week as a retreat and thought that maybe I could give some sort of testimony which would encourage the ladies. What was even more amazing, that was an immediate response came out of my mouth before I could catch the words. I'd already accepted her invitation. Well, for about 10 minutes after she'd gone, the Lord just cleared my mind completely, and I was able to write down the outline for a 30-minute sermon, which I could preach to the ladies the next day. But then my mind became a blur again, and concentration was absolutely impossible. You wouldn't believe it, but that night was the very worst night of the whole week in that house. I'd just run a hot bath, and as I sank wearily down beneath the surface of the water, the heat surged through my body, but it brought on a very strong stomach cramp. I'd read about these in the fasting books. It was a horrifying and fearful experience, during which I thought I would die. I began to palpitate so much that I thought my heart would burst. Strength completely left me and I couldn't raise myself out of the water. I was really frightened and thought I'd pass out in the bath. And in my imagination, I could see newspaper headlines, "Stupid Christian drowns in the bath whilst fasting." It must have taken all of 10 minutes to gradually drag my body out of that water, and even longer to wearily climb down the stairs to boil the kettle for a warm drink of water and fix up a hot water bottle to place on my stomach to relieve the cramp. But God pulled me through. Anyway, the next morning, after only 4 hours sleep, yet again, I wearily made my way down the road to the old people's home, wondering how on earth I was going to face these women with my mind so confused and blurred. I rang the bell, and as soon as I was admitted, my head miraculously cleared and strength surged through my body, so much so that I was able to sing and play the piano for the ladies with gusto and preach my 30-minute sermon about the dangers of old age, at the end of which the women were in tears, asking God to help with their own prayer lives. I felt alert and bright-eyed as I chatted with the deputy warden after the meeting and almost ran back to the cottage to get down to my own personal prayer and Bible reading. I thought that the Lord had taken me out of that first stage of fasting and cleared my mind completely so I could be spiritually alert and sharp. But as soon as I put my key into the door and stepped inside the house, this miraculous strength just flowed from me and I was totally exhausted. I picked up my Bible and prayed and put all the effort in that I could muster, but it just seemed like a waste because I couldn't remember anything that I'd read or anything that I'd said. When God called me to give him this week, I truly and sincerely felt that I'd break through into the spiritual realm and see God in a fresh way. But as far as I was concerned, it had been an utter failure. My physical weakness from lack of food was only proving to emphasize the stark reality of my true spiritual state with God. I was totally impoverished. And yet for all this feeling of inadequacy, the first meal that I ate filled me with a great sense of satisfaction. After all, I just completed for the very first time in my life 7 whole days on water. The food strengthened my body like magic, and I instantly felt strong both physically and spiritually. And I remembered the reading that Maurice and I had shared concerning the man who wanted to be a witch doctor. My heart filled with aspirations for what God could now do through me after giving him a week of my life in this same manner. I could imagine myself healing the sick and casting out devils and doing all sorts of things that he commanded his apostles to do. And I couldn't wait to get back to the church to see what God was going to do in my life. You know, looking back, I'm amazed how quickly pride overtook my feeling of failure. But God was good, and he didn't allow me to stay in that situation for long. The week after the fast, I was still riding high on this spiritual cloud, and I left myself very vulnerable to the attacks of Satan. Maurice had often told me what his father had said concerning war tactics. He said that you were at your most vulnerable just after a victory. That's the very time that the enemy usually plans an attack and wins because you're off your guard. During my spiritual walk, I'd had about 4 besetting sins which I'd begged God to deliver me from, and in his mercy, he'd come to my rescue. But that very first week following my fast, Satan tested me again with those 4 things, and I fell for every single one of them. I was absolutely bewildered. Surely, after the fast, I should be more spiritual rather than carnal. The tremendous guilt I felt drove me to prayer, and God spoke to me. First of all, God reminded me that my fast wasn't voluntary. It was no voluntary sacrifice. It was the result of his specific instruction to me. He told me that if I'd refused to do the fast, that would have made me disobedient, in which case I should have deserved punishment. The fact that I'd been obedient didn't mean that I was due for a reward. It meant that I was simply fulfilling my obligation to God, whom I had claimed was my Lord and Master. Secondly, God told me that fasting should never be with the motive of trying to force him to do anything. In actual fact, it was meant to be a humbling process practiced by Christians, where they could take their minds off themselves for a period of time to concentrate on God and his will. And thirdly, God finally drove it home to me just who I was. Joanna Barratt, mere flesh and blood, and my own human nature would always desire to fulfill the lusts of the flesh. He showed me that my only chance for overcoming myself would be to feed the new nature which he had given to me when I became a Christian, and to continually walk in the Spirit. When I got back home to Manchester, I prayed in all sincerity that God would never ask me to do a fast like that again, as I didn't want to refuse and make myself disobedient. But the very next year, God told me to fast again. I'm amazed at how God has taught me to trust him, because even though I knew what to expect and was scared stiff, I did what he asked me to do, and I put myself at his disposal. I'm very, very grateful to say that from that initial fast to this present day, he's never put me through that same experience again. No, God must have just been giving me a baptism of fire to see if I would put myself in his hands after rough handling. I'm glad I didn't refuse, because he's treated me very well and blessed me so much since. And as I look back, and I'm amazed at the way I saw myself as a Christian. Before that fast, I thought that I'd grown, that I'd changed. But God showed me that this wasn't the case. If he'd taken his hand from me at any moment, I would have immediately reverted to type. The only reason for my change was the fact that I was putting spiritual laws into operation and practicing what the Bible told me to do, which gave God the opportunity to alter my thinking and actions. I'm ashamed to say it, but I'd accredited all these changes to my own spirituality, and without realising it, had become self-righteous. What I had expected would be a spiritual high turned out to be a very humbling experience. But I've since learned to thank God for these apparent times of failure, because in actual fact, they're all blessings in disguise. At least I know the truth. And the Bible says that the truth, even about myself, will make me free. God bless you.